The grand arena stood proud under the open sky, its towering banners whipping in the wind like flags of conquest, while the earth vibrated with the powerful strides of alpha warriors locked in the warrior trials. At the center of it all, the Alpha King reigned from his elevated throne, his gaze sharp and unyielding as he watched his champions prove their worth. From the edges of the gathering, a lone Omega named Elara gathered her courage and stepped into the light, her simple clothes marking her as one who did not belong, her heart filled with a desperate hope that perhaps today she could claim a voice in a world that had always silenced her kind. The moment her presence registered, the Alpha King's deep voice cut through the cheers like a blade. An Omega in the warrior trials, he boomed, laughter rolling from his chest in waves that spread through the crowd until the entire arena echoed with scorn. "You dare to compete above your station, girl," he declared, his words heavy with dismissal. "This is no place for the weak or the unworthy." The laughter swelled again, crashing over Elara like a physical force that stole her breath and shattered the fragile dream she had nurtured in secret. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, her eyes stinging as the weight of every stare pressed down upon her. She could not stay. Turning sharply, Elara fled the arena, her feet pounding against the dirt path that led into the whispering embrace of the ancient forest. Trees blurred around her as she ran, tears streaming down her face, yet beneath the pain a new fire began to kindle in her chest, a quiet, defiant thought that refused to be extinguished. They laughed at her today, but something deep inside whispered that one day she would make them see. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. She leaned against an old oak, her chest heaving as a quiet resolve began to form in the silence of the woods. The pack house hummed with the steady rhythm of daily life as morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished floors and sturdy wooden tables. Elara moved through it all like a ghost, carrying baskets of fresh linens that weighed heavy on her slender arms, while higher-ranking members of the pack passed her without a second glance there. Laughter and conversations swirling around her as if she were part of the furniture rather than a living, breathing soul. The humiliation from the arena still clung to her like damp fog, the Alpha King's booming laughter, and the crowd's mocking eyes replaying in her mind with every step she took. Yet beneath the ache a new current ran through her veins, the memory of the forest and the impossible speed that had carried her far beyond the reach of their scorn. She was not nothing. The wind had shown her that much, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a glowing ember she dared not let anyone see. In the great hall she knelt to clean the long tables, the scent of pine resin and old smoke filling her lungs as she worked. Around her, alphas who had shone in the trials the day before spoke loudly of their victories there, voices filled with the easy confidence of those who had never been told they did not belong. One of them, a broad-shouldered beta servant nearby, glanced her way and muttered that some Omegas needed constant reminders of their place in the world. Elara kept her head bowed, her hands steady on the cloth, even as the words landed like small stones against her already bruised spirit. Inside, her thoughts turned inward, replaying the moment the king had dismissed her the way his laughter had spread like fire through dry grass until everyone joined in. She had wanted so badly to belong, to prove that an Omega could stand tall, but they had made her small again. Or so they thought. The secret she carried now, the gift that let her blur across the earth like living wind, it refused to be silenced by their word. She finished her chores and found a quiet corner near the back windows that overlooked the wide training ground. There the warriors moved in powerful synchronized drills, their bodies strong and sure under the bright sun as instructors called out commands that echoed across the open space. Elara watched from the shadows, her breath catching at the beauty and force of it all. Once she had only dreamed of standing among them, but after the rejection and the awakening in the woods, a different feeling stirred. What if she could train in secret? What if she could shape the gift the wind had given her until it became something no one could laugh away? Her inner resolve grew stronger with every heartbeat, the pain of invisibility transforming slowly into fuel for something greater. She would not let their dismissal define the rest of her days. A sharp call from across the hall pulled her attention back. An older Omega with tired eyes and a stern expression gestured for assistance with another heavy load, and Elara responded with a soft voice that betrayed none of the fire building inside her. "Yes, I am coming," she said, her tone respectful and quiet as she crossed the room to help. The interaction was brief and ordinary, yet it reminded her how easily she could be summoned and then forgotten again. The day continued in that same pattern of small tasks and smaller acknowledgments, each one a reminder of the station she had been born into. But every time her thoughts drifted to the forest, and the way her legs had carried her faster than any horse or wolf, she felt the ember glow brighter. She was more than they saw. She was the one who could outrun the very limits they tried to place on her. As the afternoon faded into evening, and the pack house began to quiet, Elara retreated to the small shared sleeping quarters she called her own. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the rough fabric of the blanket grounding her as her mind raced with possibility. The Alpha King had told her she had no place in the warrior world, but the wind had whispered something entirely different. She could feel it now in the restless energy in her limbs, and the way her heart quickened at the thought of slipping away again. Tonight she would go back to the trees. Tonight she would test the gift further, push it, see how far it could take her. The fear of discovery still lingered, but it was no longer stronger than the pull of her own power. She rose quietly, her movements careful and deliberate, as she prepared to step once more into the night. The path she chose was uncertain and filled with risk, but staying invisible had become the greater danger. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Elara moved toward the door, her spirit reaching for the wind that had already begun to change everything. The night air wrapped around Elara like a cool secret as she slipped from the pack house and into the embrace of the ancient woods. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in silver threads, guiding her steps along familiar paths that quickly gave way to deeper shadows and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Her heart still carried the weight of the day, the endless chores, the muttered reminders of her place, and the echo of the Alpha King's laughter that had tried to crush her spirit in front of everyone. Yet something stronger pulled her forward now, the memory of the wind and the impossible speed she had tasted only hours before. She needed to know if it had been real. She needed to feel it again. The forest welcomed her with open arms, its tall trees standing like silent guardians as she broke into a steady run, her feet finding rhythm against the earth. At first it was just running, the kind she had always known, her breath steady, her muscles working in familiar ways. But then the surge came without warning, a rush of power that started in her chest and spilled through her limbs like liquid fire. The world around her began to change. Trees that had stood solid moments ago blurred into streaks of dark and silver. The ground beneath her seemed to fall away as her strides lengthened and quickened until she was no longer simply running, but flying across the forest floor with a grace that defied everything she had ever been told about her limits. Elara's breath caught in her throat as the full force of the gift took hold. The wind roared in her ears, not as an obstacle, but as a companion that lifted her and carried her forward. She leaped over fallen logs without effort, her body moving with perfect balance and speed that made the air itself feel thick and slow around her. A deer startled from a thicket bounded away, but she passed it in a heartbeat, her form a blur even to her own eyes. The world had slowed to a crawl while she moved like lightning through it. Her thoughts raced alongside her body, the humiliation of the arena rising and then dissolving in the face of this power. They laughed at me, she thought, her inner voice fierce and wondering. They said an Omega has no place among warriors, but look at me now. I am faster than any of them could ever dream. The realization sent a wave of emotion through her chest, a mixture of awe and something dangerously close to hope. She had spent her life being invisible, a shadow in the corners of the pack house, dismissed and forgotten. Yet here in the darkness, with only the moon and the wind as witnesses, she was anything but small. She was alive in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. She pushed harder, testing the edges of what her body could do. Changing direction mid-stride, she wove between trees with impossible precision, her reflexes sharp and instinctive. The gift did not tire her. Instead, it seemed to feed on her determination, growing stronger with every stride. She ran until the familiar paths disappeared and new stretches of forest opened before her, the ground rising and falling beneath her feet like waves she could ride without effort. In those moments of pure motion, Elara felt the chains of her station begin to loosen. The Alpha King's words, the crowd's laughter, the daily erasures in the pack house, they all faded against the truth her body was revealing. She was not weak. She was not unworthy. She was the one the wind had chosen to carry its speed, and that truth filled her with a quiet fierce joy that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. Tears stung her eyes, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of release as the hidden part of herself finally stepped into the light, even if only the forest could see it. Slowing at last, she came to a stop in a small moonlit clearing, her chest rising and falling with exhilaration rather than exhaustion. The world rushed back into normal speed around her, the leaves settling, the night sounds returning to their usual pace. Elara stood with her hands on her knees, breathing in the cool air that now tasted sweeter than anything she had known. Her thoughts turned inward again, wrapping around the gift like a precious secret she would guard with everything she had. This power was hers alone, born from whatever ancient lineage had awakened inside her Omega blood. It was not something the pack or the king could take away. It was not something their laughter could diminish. For the first time since the trials, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was not invisible, where her speed could become a voice that no one could ignore. The fear of discovery still lingered at the edges of her mind, whispering warnings about what would happen if anyone learned the truth. Yet the pull of the gift was stronger. It had given her a taste of freedom, and she knew she could not turn back from it now. As she stood in the clearing, the wind stirred the leaves around her feet, almost as if it were urging her onward. In the distance, a faint howl rose and fell, carried on the night air. Elara lifted her head, her senses sharpening with the remnants of the speed still humming in her veins. Something about that sound felt different tonight, as though it were calling not just to her ears but to something deeper inside her chest, a pull she did not yet understand, but could not ignore. The forest held its breath around her, and in that quiet moment she knew her life had changed forever. The gift was no longer just a secret. It was a path, and she had already taken the first steps along it. The moonlit clearing held Elara in its quiet embrace as she lowered herself onto a moss-covered log, the cool night air brushing against her skin like a gentle reminder that she was still here, still, breathing still more than the laughter had tried to make her. Her body hummed with the afterglow of the speed that had carried her through the trees, a gift that felt both miraculous and terrifying in its power. She had outrun deer and wind itself, and the knowledge should have filled her with nothing but triumph. Yet as the rush faded, the old shadows stirred inside her chest, pulling her thoughts backward into memories she had long tried to bury. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew what was coming. Elara closed her eyes, and the past rose unbidden, vivid and sharp, as if the years between had never passed. She was small again, barely more than a child, in the crowded pack house of her youth, where the air always smelled of wood smoke and unspoken rule. Her father in Omega, like her, had carried a quiet dream in his eyes, a hope that perhaps one day their family could rise above the station assigned to them at birth. He had spoken of it only in whispers to her mother, and to Elara when no one else could hear. One afternoon, he had taken a small risk, speaking up in a gathering about fairer treatment for those born Omega. The response had been swift and merciless. Alphas in the room had turned on him with cold disdain, their words cutting like blades. They reminded him and everyone listening that Omegas existed to serve, not to dream, not to reach. Her father had been punished publicly, his spirit broken in front of the pack, until he never spoke of hope again. Elara had watched from the shadows, her small hands clenched at her sides as the laughter of those in power echoed through the hall. When she had tried later to comfort him with her own childish idea that maybe things could change, one day her mother had pulled her aside with urgent hands and tear-filled eyes. "Never speak of such things, little one," her mother had whispered, her voice trembling. "They will silence you too. They will make you invisible, so no one remembers you ever tried." The memory carried the weight of years of careful silence that followed the way Elara had learned to keep her head down and her dreams locked away where no one could mock or punish them. In the present, the clearing seemed to pulse with the same old fear as the flashback lingered. Elara's breath came shallow, her fingers tightening on the rough bark beneath her. The Alpha King's laughter from the trials had sounded so much like the laughter that had destroyed her father's quiet hope. It had tried to do the same to her, to crush the fragile courage she had gathered to step forward. Her inner thoughts circled the pain, the years of being overlooked, and erased the constant reminders that her place was small and silent. She had believed it for so long that invisibility had become her armor. Yet now the gift thrummed in her veins, refusing to be ignored. The speed that had blurred the forest tonight was the same power that had lived quietly inside her. All along, waiting for the moment she stopped believing the lies others had told her about her worth. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from defeat, but from the raw ache of remembering how deeply she had been taught to fear standing out. The trauma had shaped her into someone who ran from attention, who hid her strength, who accepted erasure as safety. But the wind had found her anyway. It had shown her a different truth, one that terrified her, because it meant she could no longer stay small without betraying the gift and the memory of her father's broken dream. She opened her eyes to the moonlight filtering through the leaves, and the forest seemed to lean closer, as if urging her to choose. The pull in her chest from earlier had not faded. It lingered like a distant thread, tugging her towards something she could not yet name. Elara rose slowly, her legs steady despite the storm of memory inside her. She would not let the past repeat itself. She would not let the king's dismissal or the pack's laughter bury her the way they had buried her father's hope. The gift was hers, and it demanded she use it, even if fear still whispered warnings in the back of her mind. As she turned back toward the deeper woods, ready to test her speed, once more a faint sound drifted on the wind. It was not the howl from before, but something closer, a distant clash of voices, and the sharp scent of trouble carried from the borderlands. Her newly sharpened senses caught it clearly, and the pull in her chest tightened. Danger was moving through the night, and somehow she knew the wind was calling her toward it. The choice stood before her, clear and unavoidable. She could turn back to the pack house and remain invisible, or she could follow the gift into the unknown and risk everything. Elara took a breath that steadied her resolve and stepped forward into the shadows, her heart beating with the first true courage she had ever claimed for herself. The pull in Elara's chest had grown stronger with every step she took through the night forest, guiding her like an invisible thread she could not ignore. After the weight of old memories had settled in the clearing, she had chosen to follow it rather than turn back toward the safety of invisibility. The wind that had carried her earlier now seemed to urge her onward, and she let the gift rise again, her body blurring into motion as she raced across the land. Trees streaked past in silver, and shadow the ground falling away beneath her feet with effortless power. Her thoughts raced alongside her body, the memory of the Alpha King's laughter still sharp in her mind, yet something deeper was drawing her forward, a connection she did not understand, but could not deny. Why did the pull lead toward him, the very man who had humiliated her in front of the entire pack? Why did her heart tighten with concern instead of the anger she expected to feel? The questions tumbled through her as she ran, but the bond refused to let her turn away. It whispered that he was in danger, and that she alone could reach him in time. She arrived at the borderlands as the first signs of trouble broke the night's quiet. The air carried the sharp scent of rogue wolves and the distant clash of bodies and steel. Elara slowed just enough to take in the scene from the cover of thick trees, her enhanced senses catching every detail. The Alpha King stood at the center of a small patrol, his powerful frame unmistakable even in the moonlight as he fought alongside his guards against a sudden ambush of rogue wolves that had crossed the border under cover of darkness. The rogues moved with feral cunning, their numbers greater than expected, and the king's group was being pressed hard. Cinematic flashes of movement cut through the shadows, steel meeting claw, and the low growls of battle rising into the night. Elara's breath caught as she watched the king parry a heavy strike, his strength evident, yet the odds turning against him with every passing moment. A rogue lunged from the side, and she felt the pull in her chest flare into something urgent and undeniable. Without thinking, she let the gift surge fully, her form dissolving into a living blur as she raced from the trees. The world slowed around her as she moved. She became the wind itself, streaking across the clearing in a path only she could see. Her first intervention was a distraction. She kicked up a whirlwind of dust and leaves that blinded two rogues mid-lunge, giving the king's guards the opening they needed to push back. She did not stop to be seen. She circled the fight again, and again, her speed creating shifting shadows and sudden gusts that disrupted the rogue's coordination without ever revealing her face or form. One rogue that had nearly landed a blow on the king found himself suddenly off balance as an unseen force swept his legs, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Another turned in confusion as leaves and debris swirled into his eyes at the exact moment a guard's blade found its mark. Elara's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness she could not explain. This was the man who had laughed at her, who had declared she had no place among warriors, yet here she was risking exposure to keep him safe. The bond thrummed between them like a living thing. She could almost feel his strength and his determination as if they were her own. Inner thoughts tumbled through her in rapid waves. He does not know me. He would laugh again if he saw who saved him. Yet I cannot let him fall. The wind chose me for this, and I will not turn away. Her speed carried her through another pass, this time creating a narrow path of clear ground that allowed one of the king's guards to reach a fallen comrade and pull him to safety. The battle shifted as the rogues began to falter, their confusion growing with every unexplained disruption. The Alpha King fought with renewed focus, his voice cutting through the chaos as he called commands that steadied his remaining men. Elara watched from the edge of the trees, her form hidden, once more her chest heaving, not from exhaustion but from the intensity of what she had done. She had used the gift openly for the first time, not for herself but for him. The realization sent a wave of emotion through her that she had no name for. It was not forgiveness. It was not yet anything as simple as care. It was something deeper and more complicated, a pull that defied the humiliation she had suffered and the fear she had carried for so long. She lingered just long enough to see the last of the rogues driven back into the darkness, the border secured for now. The king stood tall among his guards, his presence commanding even after the fight, his gaze sweeping the trees as if he sensed something more than chance had turned the tide. Elara felt the bond flare, once more a warm and insistent thread that made her want to step forward and at the same time made her want to run. She chose the shadows. Turning, she blurred back into the forest, her speed carrying her away before anyone could catch more than a fleeting glimpse of movement among the trees. As she put distance between herself and the border, her thoughts refused to quiet. The danger had passed, but the questions remained. Why had the bond pulled her so strongly? Why had she risked everything for the man who had crushed her dreams without a second thought? The wind whispered around her as she slowed at last in a quieter stretch of woods, her body still humming with power and emotion. She had saved him tonight without him ever knowing who stood in the shadows. Yet the connection between them felt stronger now, as if her actions had only tightened the invisible thread. In the distance she could still sense the aftermath of the fight, the king's presence lingering in her awareness like a beacon she could not ignore. Elara leaned against a tree, her fingers pressing into the bark as a new resolve began to form. She could not explain the bond or the pull that had driven her into danger, but she knew one thing with certainty. This was only the beginning. The wind had chosen her, and it was leading her toward a path she could no longer walk alone. The night stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty, and the faint echo of the king's voice still ringing in her memory. She had crossed a line tonight, and there would be no turning back from whatever came next. The night had not yet released its hold when Elara felt the pull return, stronger than before, tugging at her chest like an insistent hand that would not be denied. She had barely caught her breath from the border rescue when the bond flared again, this time carrying a sharper sense of urgency that drew her back toward the heart of the pack lands. The palace loomed ahead, its lights glowing warmly against the darkness as if nothing were amiss yet. The thread between her and the Alpha King whispered of hidden danger. She moved through the outer gardens with careful speed, her form a whisper among the shadows as she slipped closer to the grand hall where a feast was underway. The air carried the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, mingled with the low hum of voices and laughter from within. Elara's heart tightened with conflicting emotions. She had saved him once already in the border fight, using her gift without his knowledge. Now the bond was pulling her again, and she could not turn away, even though every part of her remembered his laughter and the way he had dismissed her so easily. Why did she care? Why did the connection feel so alive after everything he had done? The questions chased each other through her mind as she found a hidden vantage near an open window, her enhanced senses reaching into the crowded space. Inside the great hall, the feast unfolded in a blur of color and sound. Long tables groaned under platters of food, while alphas and their companions filled the room with easy conversation and the clink of goblet. The Alpha King sat at the head of the main table, his presence commanding even in this moment of celebration, his eyes scanning the gathering with the quiet vigilance of a ruler who never fully relaxed. Elara watched from her shadowed post, her breath steady despite the storm inside her. She could feel the bond more clearly, now a living thread that seemed to hum with warning. Her gaze swept the room, searching for the source of the unease, until it settled on a servant moving toward the king's table with a silver tray. On the tray sat a single goblet of dark wine, its surface catching the light in a way that made her instincts sharpen. Something was wrong with that cup. The bond pulsed insistently in her chest, confirming what her eyes had caught, a subtle shift in the servant's posture, a fleeting glance toward a cluster of rivals at a nearby table. This was no ordinary offering. It was a threat wrapped in the guise of hospitality. Time seemed to stretch as Elara let the gift rise within her. The world inside the hall slowed to a crawl while she moved. She blurred from the window ledge in a single fluid motion, slipping through a side entrance used by servants and becoming little more than a fleeting shadow against the stone walls. No one turned. No one saw. She reached the tray in the space between heartbeats, her hand steady despite the risk as she brushed the goblet just enough to send it tipping over the edge. Dark wine spilled across the polished floor in a sudden splash that drew startled gasps from those nearby. The servant stumbled in confusion, the tray tilting further as Elara's speed carried her back into the shadows before anyone could register more than a rush of air and a fallen cup. The king's gaze snapped toward the disturbance, his expression sharpening as he rose slightly from his seat. For one brief moment his eyes caught the edge of movement, a shadow that moved too quickly to be natural before it vanished into the deeper corners of the hall. He said nothing aloud, but his posture changed, his focus narrowing, as if he sensed the intervention had not been chance. Elara retreated to the safety of the outer gardens, her form hidden once more among the hedges, her chest rising and falling with the aftermath of what she had done. The bond still thrummed between them, stronger now after this second act of protection, and the realization sent a fresh wave of turmoil through her thoughts. She had acted without hesitation again, placing herself at risk for the man who had humiliated her in front of everyone. The memory of his laughter tried to rise, but it was overshadowed by the undeniable truth of the connection pulling at her. He had nearly been harmed, and she had felt it before anyone else in the room. The wind that had awakened her gift seemed tied to him in ways she could not explain, and the thought both comforted and terrified her. Inner emotions swirled in rapid succession. I should hate him for what he did. I should stay far away. Yet every time danger finds him, I am there. The bond will not let me turn away, and I am beginning to wonder if I even want it anymore. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could quiet the pull by force alone, but it only grew more insistent with each passing moment. The king was safe for now, the spilled wine drawing attention, and likely saving him from whatever had been meant for that cup. Yet the rivals in the room had noticed the disruption, and their glances toward the shadows carried new suspicion. Elara knew she could not linger. As she slipped farther into the night, the bond lingered like a warm echo that refused to fade. She had saved him twice now without ever revealing herself, and each act had only deepened the invisible thread between them. The Alpha King's presence remained in her awareness, even as distance grew a steady beacon she could not ignore. Questions multiplied in her mind with every step. Who was she becoming because of this connection? What would happen when the truth could no longer stay hidden? The wind stirred the leaves around her feet, almost as if answering in its own silent way. Elara paused at the edge of the gardens, her gaze turning back toward the glowing palace one last time. She had crossed another line tonight, moving from secret protector to someone whose fate felt increasingly bound to his. The danger had been stopped, but the cost to her own carefully guarded heart was rising with every intervention. She could feel the change inside her, the way her resolve was shifting from simple survival to something more complicated and powerful. The night stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty, yet for the first time, she did not want to run from the pull. She wanted to understand it. She wanted to know why the wind had chosen to tie her to the one man who had once tried to erase her. As she turned and blurred back into the deeper woods, the bond pulsed once more, a quiet promise that this was far from over, and that the next time danger found him, she would be there again, whether she was ready or not. The bond had become impossible to ignore in the days that followed the feast intervention, a constant, warm thread that tugged at Elara's chest whenever danger brushed too close to the Alpha King. She had tried to keep her distance, returning to the edges of pack life and her secret runs through the woods, but the pull refused to fade. It whispered of unfinished business and of threats that had not yet been fully turned away. So when the king rode out with a small hunting party into the deeper forest, Elara found herself following at a careful distance, her gift keeping her hidden while her heart warred with itself. She told herself it was only caution, that she needed to understand the connection before it consumed her. Yet deep inside she knew the truth. She could not stand by if he faced danger again. The wind that had awakened her power seemed tied to his fate now, and she was no longer willing to fight the current. The ambush struck without warning in a narrow stretch of woodland where the trees grew thick and the light filtered in broken patterns. The hunting party had scattered slightly in pursuit of game when a coordinated group of rogues struck from the undergrowth, their numbers greater than expected and their intent clear. The Alpha King found himself separated from his guards as the attackers closed in with brutal efficiency. Steel clashed and growls rose into the air as the fight turned desperate. Elara felt the bond flare with sudden sharp intensity the moment the king's isolation became clear. Her body responded before her mind could form a single doubt. She let the gift surge to its fullest, her form dissolving into a living gale as she raced toward the chaos. The forest blurred around her in streaks of green and brown, while the world slowed to a crawl. She became the wind itself, moving faster than any rogue or alpha could track her speed, turning the narrow paths into her personal battlefield.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
She reached the clearing in heartbeats, and the sight that met her made her chest tighten with fierce protectiveness. The Alpha King stood with his back to a broad tree, his blade flashing as he held off 3 rogues who circled with predatory intent. His guards were engaged elsewhere, the sounds of their own battles echoing through the trees. Elara did not hesitate. She blurred into the fight like a storm given form, her first pass sending one rogue sprawling as an unseen force swept his legs from under him. The king's eyes widened at the sudden shift, but he had no time to question it as another attacker lunged. Elara circled again, her speed creating gusts of wind that threw dirt and leaves into the rogues' faces, disrupting their coordination. She moved like living lightning, striking from angles no one could predict, her agility letting her evade claws and blades while delivering precise disruptions that turned the tide. One rogue who had nearly landed a heavy blow found himself suddenly off balance as she passed in a blur, sending him crashing into a tree trunk. Another turned in confusion only to meet the king's blade as Elara's speed created the perfect opening. The chase had begun in earnest now as the remaining rogues tried to flee into the deeper wood, sensing that an unseen force had joined the fight. Elara did not let them escape. She pursued with everything the gift could give her body, a streak of motion that outpaced even the fastest among them. Trees blurred past as she wove between them, her reflexes sharp and instinctive, the world still slowed around her while she moved at impossible velocity. She caught one rogue mid-stride, sweeping his feet and leaving him for the king's pursuing guard. Another tried to double back only to find her already there, a living wall of wind and speed that forced him into the open where the Alpha King could finish the fight. The final attacker ran deeper into the forest, but Elara chased him down with relentless grace, her form little more than a shadow and a rush of air. She overtook him in seconds, her speed turning the pursuit into something almost effortless. The rogue stumbled in shock as an unseen force tripped him, and before he could rise, the king's blade found its mark. The battle ended in a sudden quiet broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the rustle of settling leaves. Elara slowed at the edge of the clearing, her form hidden once more among the trees, her chest rising and falling with the intensity of what she had done. She had chased them down like the wind itself, using every ounce of the gift to protect the man who had once laughed her out of the trial. The bond pulsed between them stronger than ever, a warm, insistent presence that made her want to step forward even as every lesson from her past screamed at her to stay hidden. The Alpha King stood in the clearing, his gaze sweeping the trees with sharp awareness. For one charged moment his eyes caught the edge of her retreating form, a fleeting glimpse of movement too swift and graceful to be natural. He said nothing, but his posture shifted, as if he sensed the truth of who had turned the fight. Elara felt the bond flare in response, a deep and undeniable connection that left her breathless. She had saved him again, this time more openly than before, and the knowledge sent a storm of emotion through her chest. She could no longer pretend this was only about the wind or the gift. Something between them had changed, and she did not yet know how to name it. As she blurred back into the deeper forest, her thoughts refused to quiet. The chase had revealed the full extent of her power and the depth of the bond that tied her to the king. She had risked everything to protect him, and part of her no longer wanted to hide from the truth of why. The wind whispered around her as she slowed, at last, her body humming with power and unresolved feeling. The Alpha King was safe, but the connection between them had grown too strong to ignore. Elara paused beneath a canopy of leaves, her fingers brushing the bark as she looked back toward the clearing she had left behind. She had chased down his enemies, and in doing so she had begun to chase something else as well, a truth about herself and about the man she had once feared. The path ahead felt uncertain and dangerous, yet for the first time, she did not want to run from it. She wanted to understand why the wind had bound her to him, and what it would demand of them both before the end. The forest held its breath around her, and in the quiet, she knew the next time their paths crossed, nothing would be the same. The Alpha King stood alone in his private study, the heavy oak doors closed against the world as the events of the past days pressed down upon him like a weight he could no longer ignore. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long shadows across maps and scattered reports that told only fragments of the truth. He had faced danger at the border, and again in the forest during the hunt, and each time an unseen force had intervened with impossible speed and precision. The rogues had been scattered, the poisoned cup had spilled, and the final ambush had ended with a chase that defied every law of nature he knew. His guard spoke in hushed tones of a shadow that moved like the wind itself, but the king knew better. This was no ordinary ally or coincidence. Something or someone had chosen to protect him, and the realization stirred a deep unease in his chest that refused to settle. He paced the length of the room, his powerful frame tense, as his mind replayed every moment, searching for answers that would not come easily. He sank into the chair behind his desk, the leather creaking beneath his weight as he allowed the mask of command to slip for the first time in days. His thoughts turned inward to the one moment he had tried to push aside since the warrior trials. The Omega woman who had stepped forward with quiet courage, only to be met with his laughter and public dismissal. He had spoken without thought, declaring that she had no place among warriors, her station, making her unworthy in his eyes. The memory of her face, the way her shoulders had tightened before she fled, had lingered at the edges of his mind, but he had buried it beneath the duties of rule and the certainty of tradition. Now that certainty cracked. The mysterious savior who had saved him twice moved with a speed that no alpha could match, a grace that reminded him of something he could not yet name. What if it had been her? What if the woman he had humiliated carried a power he had been too blind and too arrogant to see? The thought landed like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding. Regret rose in him like a tide he could no longer hold back. He had upheld the old ways without question, believing that strength and station were the only measures that mattered. He had laughed at her dream because it challenged the order he protected, and in doing so he had crushed something rare and valuable. The king's inner voice turned harsh and unsparing as he faced the truth he had avoided. She had come to the trials with hope, and he had made her small. He had made her run. Now danger circled his rule, and an unseen hand had reached out to steady it. If that hand belonged to the Omega he had dismissed, then his mistake ran deeper than he had ever imagined. He saw again the way she had stood before him, the quiet fire in her eyes that he had chosen to extinguish with a single cruel word. The bond he had never expected to feel stirred faintly in his awareness, a warm and insistent thread that made the regret sharper. He did not yet understand the connection, but he could no longer deny that something had shifted. Inside him the moment he began to question his own judgment. He rose from the chair and moved to the window, his gaze sweeping the darkened forest beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there the shadow savior waited, and he would find her. He would uncover the truth of who had saved him and why. The search would begin at first light, with quiet orders to trusted eyes and careful questions that would not alert his rivals. Yet even as he planned, the king's thoughts returned again and again to the Omega he had wronged. He wondered what had become of her after she fled the arena. He wondered if the fire he had glimpsed in her had survived his laughter, or if he had broken something that could never be mended. The regret settled deeper into his bones, a quiet vow forming beneath it. If she was the one who had protected him, then he owed her more than an apology. He owed her the chance to stand where he had once told her she did not belong. The night stretched long and silent around him as the king remained at the window, his reflection, staring back with eyes that no longer held the same certainty. The old ways had failed him when danger came. Perhaps the woman he had dismissed carried the strength he had overlooked all along. He would find her. He would face what he had done, and he would begin to make it right, no matter how long the road proved to be. The days that followed carried a new tension through the Pack lands as the Alpha King's quiet investigation rippled outward in subtle ways. Elara felt it in the changed atmosphere around the palace and in the way her own secret runs through. The woods now carried an undercurrent of awareness that had not been there before. She continued her training in the hidden hours before dawn, letting the gift surge through her body, until the forest became a blur of motion and power. Each time she ran, she felt the bond stronger than before, a warm and insistent thread that refused to loosen its hold. She told herself she trained only for herself, to master the speed that had become her greatest secret and her greatest hope. Yet every stride carried thoughts of the king, the man who had once laughed at her and who now moved through the world with a new sharpness in his gaze, as if searching for something he could not yet name. The contradiction sat heavy in her chest. She had saved him multiple times without his knowledge, and now he hunted for the truth, while she remained a shadow at the edges of his sight. She returned to her duties in the Pack house as the sun rose, trying to slip back into the familiar pattern of invisibility. Yet the king's presence seemed to linger everywhere. She caught glimpses of him in the corridors, his tall frame moving with purpose as he spoke in low tones to trusted advisor. Once their paths crossed near the training grounds where she carried fresh water for the warriors. He paused for the briefest moment, his eyes finding hers across the distance. There was no laughter in his gaze, now only a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. He nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement that felt heavier than it should have. Elara lowered her head quickly, her heart racing as she continued on her way, but the charged glance lingered in her thoughts long after. She had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps regret, that made the bond between them pulse with new warmth. Her inner voice whispered warnings, even as another part of her leaned toward the possibility that he was changing. He does not know it was me. He cannot. Yet the way he looked at me felt different, as if he sees more than the Omega he once dismissed. Later that same day, the king passed through the great hall, while Elara worked quietly at the edges, clearing tables after a midday meal. A heavy tray slipped from her hands as she turned too quickly, the dishes clattering toward the floor. Before she could react, a strong hand steadied the tray from the other side, preventing the crash. She looked up to find the Alpha King himself, holding the edge, his expression unreadable, yet his touch careful and steady. For one suspended moment their fingers nearly brushed, and the bond flared between them like a spark catching dry tinder. Elara's breath caught in her throat as she met his eyes. There was no mockery, there only a quiet searching that made her feel seen in a way she had never allowed herself to want. "Thank you," she managed, her voice soft and steady despite the storm inside her. He released the tray with a small nod, his gaze lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Be careful," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than a simple warning. Then he moved on, leaving her standing in the sudden quiet of the hall, her heart pounding with emotions she could not name. The small act of care had been nothing, and everything at once a fleeting moment that cracked the wall she had built around her heart. Elara retreated to the shadows of the Pack house as soon as her duties allowed her, thoughts in turmoil. The bond had grown stronger with every near miss and every charged glance. She could no longer pretend it was only the wind or the gift that tied her to him. Something deeper was awakening between them, a slow and careful unfolding that both terrified and drew her forward. She feared what would happen if he discovered the truth of who had saved him. She feared even more what would happen if he never did. Her inner thoughts circled the contradiction of her feelings, the memory of his laughter warring with the quiet respect she had glimpsed in his eyes today. He had helped her without knowing who she was. He had looked at her as if she mattered. The realization sent a wave of warmth through her chest that she tried and failed to push away. The slow burn of connection was becoming harder to deny with every passing day and every accidental meeting. She had spent so long being invisible that being seen even for a moment left her unsteady and yearning for more. As evening fell, and she slipped once more into the woods for her secret training, the bond pulsed with quiet insistence. Elara ran until the world blurred around her, the gift carrying her far and fast, yet her thoughts remained anchored to the king and the charged moments they had shared. She knew he was searching for the shadow savior. She knew the day would come when hiding would no longer be possible. The wind whispered around her as she slowed in a moonlit, clearing her body, humming with power and unresolved feeling. She had glimpsed something new in him today, and it had cracked the armor she had worn for so long. The path ahead felt uncertain and filled with risk, yet she could not bring herself to turn away from the pull. Not anymore. The bond had chosen them both, and whether she was ready or not, the truth was beginning to surface. One charged glance, and one careful touch at a time. Elara stood in the quiet of the forest, her heart open to possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine, and for the first time the fear was matched by something stronger, a quiet and growing hope that perhaps the wind had led her here for reasons far greater than survival alone. The moon hung full and bright above the ancient woods, casting silver light across the clearing where Elara had come to train in secret. She had felt the bond pulling her here tonight stronger than ever before, as if the wind itself had arranged this meeting beneath the stars. Her body still hummed from the speed she had unleashed moments earlier, yet her thoughts remained tangled with the memory of the king's quiet care in the great hall and the charged glances that had passed between them. She told herself she should leave before anyone found her, but the pull refused to let her move. The night air felt charged with possibility, and she stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous, hope. He found her there, as if the bond had guided his steps as surely as it had guided hers. The Alpha King emerged from the tree line, his tall frame silhouetted against the moonlight, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes carrying the weight of days of searching and reflection. For a long moment neither spoke, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of night birds. Elara's breath caught as she met his gaze. She had expected anger or suspicion, but what she saw instead was something far more complicated, a quiet recognition mixed with regret that made the bond between them flare with sudden warmth. He took a single step closer, his voice low, when he finally spoke. "I've been looking for the one who saved me, the shadow who moved like the wind itself." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elara remained silent, her heart pounding as she waited for the moment she had both dreaded and longed for. The king's posture softened as he continued, his inner thoughts turning raw and honest in the quiet of the night. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." His voice carried the depth of true regret as he faced the truth he had avoided for too long. "I laughed at you in the arena. I told you that you had no place among warriors because I could not see beyond your station. I was wrong." The words landed with quiet power, and Elara felt the old wound in her chest begin to ease, even as new emotions rose to take its place. He switched fully into his own perspective for a moment, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him with full force. He saw again the way she had stood before him with quiet courage, and how he had crushed it without thought. The arrogance of his past actions now felt like a chain around his own heart. "I dismissed you without ever considering what strength you might carry. I upheld a tradition that blinded me to the very power that just saved my life. For that I am sorry, truly and deeply sorry." Elara's inner thoughts raced as she listened, the bond pulsing between them like a living heartbeat. She had imagined many outcomes to this moment, but never this one. The sincerity in his voice and the regret in his eyes cracked the last of her defenses. She took a small step forward, her own voice steady, yet filled with the emotion she had carried for so long. "You hurt me that day. You made me feel invisible, when all I wanted was a chance to prove myself." The words came from a place of hard-won strength, and the king listened without interrupting, his expression open in a way she had never seen before. "But I am not the same person who ran from the arena. The wind found me. It gave me something no one can take away." She did not reveal the full extent of her gift, but the truth of her transformation hung in the air between them. The king nodded slowly, his regret deepening into something closer to awe. "I see that now. I see you." The simple declaration carried more weight than any grand speech could have. The bond between them strengthened in that moment, a warm and undeniable connection that made the night feel smaller and more intimate than it had any right to be. They stood together under the stars, the silence no longer heavy, but filled with the careful beginning of understanding. The king did not press for more than she was willing to give, and Elara did not offer more than she was ready to share. Yet something had shifted between them, a slow and earned tenderness that neither could deny. He offered no promises beyond the honesty of his apology, and she accepted it without surrendering the power she had claimed for herself. The wind stirred the leaves around their feet, almost as if approving of the fragile bridge being built in the moonlight. Elara felt the old fear of visibility begin to loosen its hold, even as new questions rose about what this connection would demand of them both. The king's gaze remained steady on her, his own thoughts filled with the weight of what he had done and the possibility of what they might become. Neither moved to close the distance between them, but the bond pulsed with quiet promise that this was only the first step on a longer path. As the night deepened around them, Elara knew she could no longer pretend the connection was only danger or duty. It was becoming something far more profound, and she was no longer certain she wanted to resist it. The stars watched in silence as two souls who had once stood on opposite sides of laughter and dismissal began the slow and careful work of seeing each other clearly for the first time. The palace corridors whispered with new tension in the days after the moonlit encounter as the Alpha King's quiet shift in perspective began to ripple through the pack like wind across still water. Elara felt the change everywhere, in the way some Alphas now watched her with narrowed eyes and in the way conversations fell silent when she passed carrying her usual load. She had returned to her duties with the same careful invisibility, yet the bond that had strengthened under the stars refused to let her remain untouched by the growing unrest. The king's apology and the honesty they had shared had cracked something open inside her, and she could no longer pretend she was only a shadow moving through the halls. She had become something more, a symbol whether she wished it or not, and the weight of that truth settled on her shoulders with every passing hour. She moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, her enhanced senses catching fragments of conversations that had not been meant for her ears. In the shadowed corners of the great hall and along the outer walkways, traditionalist Alphas gathered in small clusters, their voices low but sharp with discontent. They spoke of the king's growing softness, of the rumors that an Omega had somehow influenced his decisions, and of the need to remind him where true power belonged. Elara paused in a hidden alcove, her breath steady as she listened to words that made her blood run cold. They plotted not with open rebellion, but with careful whispers, spreading doubt among the guards and questioning the king's judgment in private council. One voice rose slightly above the others, a rival Alpha whose ambition had always simmered beneath the surface. If an Omega can turn the king's head, then perhaps it is time we remind him what happens when tradition is ignored. The words carried the promise of traps and quiet sabotage, aimed not only at the king, but at anyone who might stand beside him. Elara's inner thoughts churned as she slipped away from the alcove, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had overheard. She had wanted only to master her gift and survive in the shadows, yet the bond and the king's changing heart had pulled her into something far larger than herself. The rivals were not content to let the old ways fade quietly. They would move against the king's softening stance and against the rumors of the Omega savior who had protected him. She felt the burden of becoming a symbol settle deeper into her chest. If they discovered her role in the rescues, the danger would turn directly toward her. Yet even as fear whispered its warnings, a stronger voice rose inside her, the same fire that had carried her through the trials and into the wind's embrace. She would not let them undo the fragile progress that had begun under the stars. She would not let the king face this alone, even if she must remain hidden a little longer. The political conflict tightened around her like a net she could feel, but not yet see. Subtle traps appeared in small ways, a sudden change in her duties that placed her in more visible spaces, a whispered rumor that reached her ears about an Omega who had grown too bold. Elara navigated each one with careful grace, her speed gift kept secret, while her mind worked to understand the shifting alliances. She caught the king's eye once across a crowded corridor, and the bond pulsed between them with quiet strength. He was fighting his own battles in the council chambers, and she was fighting hers in the shadows. The weight of it all pressed down on her, yet it also ignited something new, a determination to protect not only the man who had once dismissed her, but the possibility of a different future for every Omega who had ever been told to stay small. She slipped into the woods that night, her body blurring into motion as she ran to clear her thoughts and strengthen her resolve. The wind carried her far and fast, but it could not carry away the truth she now faced. The rivals were moving, and their whispers of rebellion would soon become actions that threatened everything she and the king had begun to build between them. As she slowed in a quiet clearing, the bond flared once more, a warm and urgent reminder that she was no longer alone in this fight. Elara stood beneath the stars, her chest rising and falling with the aftermath of what she had learned. The political storm was gathering, and she knew she could not remain a silent observer for much longer. The rivals had set their sights on the king's changing heart and on the Omega who had somehow touched it. She would have to choose how to stand against them when the time came. For now she carried the knowledge like a blade hidden at her side, ready to be drawn when the whispers finally turned to open threat. The night stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty, yet Elara felt the fire inside her burn brighter than ever before. She had come too far to let old traditions and ambitious rivals silence the wind that had given her a voice. The path forward would be dangerous, but she would walk it with the same courage that had carried her from the arena to this moment. The bond pulsed in quiet agreement, and she knew that whatever came next she would face it not as the invisible Omega she had once been, but as the woman the wind had chosen to become. The tension that had been building in whispers finally broke into open action on a quiet evening, when Elara was sent on an errand that took her beyond the palace walls. She had sensed the trap even before she left the safety of the pack house, the sudden change in her duties and the way certain alphas had watched her departure with too much interest. Yet she had gone anyway, her resolve stronger than her fear. The rivals had grown bold in their opposition to the king's shifting views and the rumors of the Omega who had touched his heart. Now they intended to remove the threat she represented before it could grow any stronger. Elara moved along the forest path, her steps careful and her senses sharp. The bond pulsed in her chest, a steady reminder that danger was near and that the king was not far if she needed him. She would not call for him. Not yet. This was her fight as much as his, and she would meet it with the strength the wind had given her. The ambush came without warning as she reached a narrow bend in the path. 3 alphas loyal to the old ways stepped from the trees, their expressions hard and their intent clear. They did not attack with claws or steel, but with words and the threat of exposure. "We know what you are," they said, their voices low and menacing. "The shadow that saved the king. The Omega who thinks she can change everything." Elara's heart pounded, but she did not run. Not immediately. She stood her ground, her chin lifting as the fire inside her refused to be extinguished by their threats. "You are mistaken," she answered, her voice steady despite the danger closing in. "I am only an Omega doing her duty." The leader of the group laughed, a cold sound that echoed the mockery she had once endured in the arena. "Your duty ends here. Come quietly, and perhaps the king will never learn how deeply you have interfered." The words carried the weight of a trap designed to silence her, without ever letting the truth reach the one person who might protect her. Elara felt the bond flare with sudden urgency, as if the king sensed her peril from wherever he stood. She could have blurred away in an instant, using the gift to escape before they could react. Yet something inside her refused to flee without a fight. She had spent too long being invisible, too long accepting the chains others placed on her. The wind had chosen her for more than running. It had chosen her to stand. When one of the alphas moved to grab her arm, she let the gift surge just enough to twist free her, speed turning the moment into a blur of motion that left them stumbling in confusion. She did not fully reveal herself, but the glimpse of impossible velocity was enough to confirm their suspicion. "The Omega can run like the wind," one of them shouted as they gave chase. Elara blurred along the path, her form streaking between the trees as she led them deeper into the forest. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. She would not be caught. She would not be silenced again. The pursuit stretched through the woods, her speed keeping her just ahead, while the alphas crashed through the undergrowth behind her. She could have outrun them completely, but she chose instead to circle back, testing her control and buying time for the bond to guide help if it came. The gift carried her with effortless grace, the world slowing around her as she wove between trees and over fallen logs. Yet even as she escaped, the partial exposure weighed on her. They had seen enough to know she was no ordinary Omega. The secret she had guarded so carefully was beginning to crack, and the consequences would ripple outward whether she was ready or not. As she finally broke away and disappeared into a denser stretch of forest, the bond pulsed one last time, a warm and urgent presence that told her the king was moving. She had stood her ground. She had used her power when it mattered, and now the rivals knew she was more than they had believed. Elara slowed at last in a hidden clearing, her chest rising and falling as the adrenaline faded. The trap had sprung, and she had survived, but the cost was a truth now partially revealed. The political conflict had become personal, and the rivals would not stop until they either silenced her or forced the king to choose between the old ways and the woman who had saved him. She leaned against a tree, her fingers pressing into the bark as resolve settled deeper into her bones. She could no longer remain in the shadows waiting for danger to pass. The wind had given her speed and strength, and she would use both to protect what had begun to grow between her and the king. The night stretched ahead, filled with new uncertainty, yet Elara felt no desire to run from it. She had faced the trap and emerged with her courage intact. Whatever came next, she would meet it not as the invisible Omega she had once been, but as the woman who had outrun her own fear and claimed her place in the storm. The bond pulsed in quiet agreement, and she knew the next confrontation would decide far more than her own safety. It would decide the future they were only beginning to imagine together. The call came in the quiet hours before dawn, a deep and ancient pull that resonated through Elara's chest like the wind itself had found its voice. She had returned to the palace grounds after the trap in the forest, her body still humming with the aftermath of speed and courage. Yet sleep would not come. Instead, the bond pulsed with new urgency, guiding her steps toward a place she had only heard of in whispered stories, the ancient ritual site hidden deep in the oldest part of the woods where Omega heritage had once been honored before the old ways buried it. The king found her at the edge of the palace gardens, his presence steady and his eyes carrying the same awareness that had grown between them since the moonlit apology. He did not question how she knew the way. He simply walked beside her as the bond drew them both forward into the shadowed trees. Together they moved through the forest until the trees parted to reveal a circle of standing stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and moonlight. The air here felt different, charged with power that made Elara's skin tingle and her gift stir restlessly beneath the surface. She stepped into the circle, first her heart beating with a mixture of awe and the old fear that had once kept her silent. The king remained at the edge, his presence a quiet anchor as the ritual site responded to her arrival. Ancient symbols carved into the stones began to glow with soft silver light, and the wind rose around her in a gentle spiral that carried the scent of earth and distant storm. Elara closed her eyes and let the call wash over her. This was no ordinary place. It was a remnant of a time when Omegas had stood as equals, when their gifts had been celebrated rather than hidden. The wind that had awakened her speed now whispered of deeper power waiting to be claimed. She felt the first surge ripple through her body, her speed gift responding to the ancient energy with a strength she had never experienced before. The world around her slowed dramatically, the glowing stones becoming streaks of light as her form blurred and steadied in the same breath. Visions flashed behind her closed eyes, images of omegas running like living gales across open plains, of councils where all ranks stood together, of a future where her voice could shape the world instead of being erased by it. The power built inside her like a storm gathering strength. Elara's inner thoughts raced with the intensity of the transformation beginning within her. She had feared this moment for so long, the idea of standing fully in her power and being seen. Yet here in the ancient circle, with the king's steady presence at the edge and the wind itself guiding her, she felt the fear begin to dissolve. The gift was no longer something she had to hide. It was her birthright, awakened by the very heritage the old ways had tried to silence. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming release of finally accepting what she had been given. The speed surged again, carrying her in a graceful arc around the circle, her movements so fast the stones themselves seemed to sing in response. She felt connected to something vast and ancient, a lineage of power that had waited for her to claim it. The bond with the king pulsed in harmony with the ritual, as if he too were being drawn into the awakening, even from the edge of the circle. His support, without demand or expectation, gave her the courage to let the transformation continue. As the first phase of the ritual reached its peak, Elara slowed and opened her eyes, the silver light of the stones fading back into the quiet of the night. She stood transformed in small but profound ways, her speed now sharper and more responsive, her senses expanded to feel the wind as an extension of herself. The visions lingered in her mind, promising more to come if she continued down this path. Yet the ritual was not complete. The ancient site had awakened only the beginning of what she could become, and the full transformation still waited for her to embrace it completely. Elara turned toward the king, her gaze meeting his across the distance. She saw awe and quiet respect in his expression, and the bond between them deepened with the shared understanding of what had just begun. The wind settled around her feet as if resting after its work, and she knew that the next phase would demand even more of her courage. She had taken the first step into her destiny, but the path ahead still held challenges that would test everything she had learned. The ritual site stood silent, once more, its ancient power waiting for her return. Elara stepped from the circle, her body humming with new strength, and her heart open to whatever the wind and the bond would ask of her next. The transformation had started, and there would be no turning back from the power and the purpose that now flowed through her veins. The ancient ritual site called to Elara once more as the moon climbed higher, its silver light pouring over the standing stones like a blessing from the winds of old. She had returned with the Alpha King at her side, the bond between them now a steady and undeniable presence that guided every step. The first phase had awakened something deep within her, but the site had made it clear that the full transformation still waited. Tonight the circle would complete what it had begun. Elara stepped into the glowing stones without hesitation, her heart open and her spirit ready. The wind rose immediately, stronger than before, swirling around her in a protective spiral that lifted her hair and carried the scent of freedom and ancient power. The king remained at the edge, his presence a quiet strength that anchored her even as the ritual claimed her fully. The power surged without warning, this time a tidal wave of speed and awareness that flooded every part of her being. Elara's form blurred and steadied in the same breath, the world around her slowing to a crawl while she moved with impossible grace. The gift that had once been a secret burst of velocity now became something far greater, a living embodiment of the wind itself. She could feel every current, every shift in the air, as if it were an extension of her own body. Visions returned clearer than before, showing her not only the past, but the future she could help shape, a world where omegas stood equal, where gifts like hers were celebrated rather than feared. The transformation crowned her in that moment. She was no longer simply fast. She was the wind's chosen, the one who could outrun doubt and silence, and every chain the old ways had tried to place on her. Tears of release and joy slipped down her cheeks as she embraced the full bloom of her power. The fear that had once kept her small dissolved, completely replaced by radiant confidence and a purpose that burned bright in her chest. As the ritual reached its peak, the bond with the Alpha King deepened into something profound and unbreakable. It was not a physical claiming, but a spiritual union of souls that wove their fates together in the ancient way of fated mates. Elara felt his strength and his regret, and his growing respect flow into her even as her own courage and transformed power flowed back to him. The connection settled into her heart like a warm and steady flame that would never again be extinguished. She emerged from the circle transformed in every way that mattered, her speed now legendary, her senses sharp and her spirit shining with the light of one who had finally claimed her destiny. The king stepped forward to meet her, his eyes filled with awe and unwavering support. He saw not the Omega he had once dismissed, but the woman the wind had crowned, the one who had saved him and who now stood ready to change everything. No words were needed in that moment. The bond spoke for them both, carrying the depth of what they had become to each other. Elara stood in the moonlight, her body humming with power and her heart steady for the first time in her life. She had walked through fear and humiliation and political traps to reach this moment, and the wind had met her at every turn. The transformation was complete. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. She was the embodiment of speed and freedom and the quiet strength that could reshape a world. The king offered his hand, and she took it without hesitation, the bond flaring with quiet promise between them. Together they turned from the ancient site, ready to face whatever came next. The rivals still plotted, the old ways still resisted, but none of it could touch the power that now flowed through her veins, or the connection that now bound her to the man who had once been her greatest pain and was becoming her greatest ally. The night stretched ahead, filled with challenge and possibility, yet Elara walked forward with her head high and her spirit soaring. The wind had chosen her, and she had finally chosen herself. Whatever legacy they built together would begin from this moment of full awakening and unbreakable bond. The forest whispered its approval as they left the circle behind, and Elara knew that the brightest chapters of her story were only just beginning. The great hall had never felt so heavy with tension as it did on the morning the rivals forced their final reckoning. Word of the Omega, who moved like the wind, had spread despite every attempt to keep it quiet, and the traditionalist alphas had chosen this moment to strike. They called for a public assembly under the guise of addressing border threats, but everyone present knew the true target. Elara stood at the edge of the gathering, her transformed power humming quietly beneath her skin as she watched the king take his place at the head of the hall. The bond between them pulsed with steady strength, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. She had come here not as the invisible Omega who had once fled in tears, but as the woman the ancient winds had crowned. The rivals spoke first, their voices sharp with accusation, as they laid out their claims about an Omega who had interfered in the king's affairs and threatened the old order. They demanded she be brought forward and judged. Elara felt every eye turned toward her, and for one breath she tasted the old fear. Then she stepped into the center of the hall, her head high and her spirit unshakable. The hall fell into stunned silence as she revealed herself fully. There was no mask left to wear, no shadow left to hide in. She stood before the pack and let them see the woman who had outrun their mockery and their traps. Her voice carried clear and strong as she began to speak, recounting the journey that had brought her here. I came to the warrior trials with nothing but hope, she said, her words echoing off the stone walls. The Alpha King laughed at me. He told me I had no place among warriors because of the station I was born into. The crowd shifted uneasily, but she did not falter. I ran from that laughter, carrying shame I did not deserve. Yet the wind found me in the forest. It gave me speed no one could match. When danger came for the king, I used that speed to protect him, not once, but many times. She turned her gaze to the rivals who had plotted against her. You tried to silence me with traps and threats. You tried to keep the old ways alive by crushing anyone who threatened them. But the wind does not answer to tradition. It answers to those who are willing to run when others tell them to stay still. The king rose from his seat, his presence commanding as he added his voice to hers. She speaks the truth. This Omega saved my life when my own guards could not. She moved with power I had never seen, and she asked for nothing in return. His words carried the weight of public acknowledgement, and the hall rippled with shock and whispered awe. Elara felt the bond flare with pride and support. She had not needed him to defend her, yet his choice to stand beside her in front of everyone healed the last of the old wound he had once inflicted. To prove her words, she let the gift surge in a controlled demonstration. In the space of a heartbeat, she blurred across the hall, and back again, her form becoming little more than a streak of motion that left the air stirring in her wake. Gasps rose from the gathered pack. Even the rivals fell silent, their certainty cracking in the face of undeniable power. Elara stopped in the center, once more her breathing steady, and her eyes bright with the fire of one who had finally claimed her voice. "I am not above my station," she declared. "I am redefining what station means. Every Omega who has ever been told to stay silent, every soul who has ever been made invisible, deserves the chance to run as far and as fast as their gifts allow. The old ways end here." The hall erupted into a storm of voices, some shouting in protest, others murmuring in stunned respect. The rivals tried to regain control, but their words fell flat against the truth that had just been demonstrated. Elara stood unmoved, her transformed power and her hard-won courage making her larger than the fear they had once used against her. The king's gaze met hers across the distance, and the bond between them shone with quiet triumph. She had faced the pack that had once laughed at her, and she had not only survived but risen. The confrontation had stripped away the last of her invisibility, and in its place stood a woman who would no longer be dismissed. As the voices rose and fell around her, Elara knew this was only the beginning. The rivals would not surrender easily, and the changes she demanded would require more than one reckoning. Yet she had taken the stage and claimed her power in front of everyone who mattered. The wind had carried her here, and she would not be silenced again. The Great Hall would remember this day as the moment an Omega stood before them all and demanded a future where no one was forced to remain invisible. Elara lifted her chin and let the silence that followed her demonstration speak louder than any further words could. She had arrived at this moment through pain and speed and quiet determination. Now she would shape what came next. The Great Hall still hummed with the aftermath of the reckoning when the Alpha King turned to Elara and offered her his hand in front of the entire pack. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything they had survived and everything they were choosing to build together. She took it without hesitation, her transformed power steady and her heart open. In that moment the pack witnessed not only her strength, but the bond that had grown between them. Through danger, regret, and slow earned understanding, the king spoke clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "This Omega has proven herself in ways no one expected. She has saved my life, and she has shown us all what true courage looks like. From this day forward, she stands at my side as queen." The words rippled through the gathering like wind across water. Some faces showed shock, others quiet respect, and a few still carried the resistance of the old ways. Yet no one could deny what they had seen. Elara had blurred across the hall with impossible speed, and she had spoken with a voice that refused to be silenced. The title settled on her shoulders not as a burden, but as a promise she intended to keep. She stood beside the king, her inner thoughts racing with the enormity of how far she had come. Only weeks ago she had been invisible, carrying trays and scrubbing tables, while the pack moved around her as if she were made of air. She had fled the arena in tears after being laughed at for daring to dream. Now she stood in the center of power with the wind's gift fully awakened in her veins, and the man who had once dismissed her now choosing her as his equal. The journey had been painful and uncertain, but every step had led her here. She felt the bond pulse between them, a warm and steady presence that reminded her she did not carry this new role alone. The king's support was not a cage. It was a partnership built on respect and the slow healing of old wounds. Elara drew a breath and let her voice rise once more, this time not in defense, but in declaration. "As your queen, I will open the warrior training grounds to every rank. No one will be turned away because of the station they were born into. Every gift, whether speed or strength or quiet wisdom, will have space to grow." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "I will also create protections for Omegas and all who have been made to feel invisible. No one will be punished for reaching beyond the limits others have placed on them." The decrees were bold and immediate, and they landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the hall. The initial response was mixed. Some alphas nodded with growing respect, while others shifted uncomfortably at the breaking of long-held traditions. Elara felt the resistance, but she did not waver. She had faced laughter and traps and the weight of her own fear. She could face this too. The king stood beside her, his presence reinforcing every word she spoke. Together they presented a united front that made it clear these changes would not be undone by whispers or plot. Elara's thoughts turned inward as she looked out over the gathered pack. She remembered the little girl who had watched her father's hope be crushed and who had learned to stay small to survive. She remembered the Omega who had stepped into the arena with fragile courage only to be shattered by public scorn. And she remembered the woman who had discovered her speed in the forest and chosen to use it not for escape, but for protection and for change. Every version of herself had led to this moment. She was no longer running from who she was. She was running toward the future she intended to create for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. As the assembly began to disperse, Elara remained at the king's side, her hand still in his, the bond between them glowing with quiet triumph. The first decrees had been spoken, and the path to equality had been opened. Yet she knew the work had only begun. There would be resistance, and there would be moments when the old ways tried to push back. She would meet them with the same courage that had carried her from invisibility to this throne. The wind stirred through the open doors of the hall as if celebrating with her, and Elara felt its presence like a promise. She had claimed her voice and her power. Now she would use both to lift others who had once been forced to stay silent. The queen who had once been an invisible Omega stood ready to reshape her world one decree and one brave step at a time. The future felt vast and bright, and for the first time she walked toward it not as someone chasing the wind, but as someone who had become it. The final challenge came not in the shadows, but in the open light of the council chamber where the last of the old guard gathered to test the strength of the new order. Elara entered the room with the Alpha King at her side, her transformed power steady and her resolve unshakable. The rivals who had plotted against her and whispered of rebellion now sat across the long table, their expressions hard with the knowledge that their time was ending. They had hoped to force a confrontation that would undo the decrees she had made. Instead, they found a queen who had already walked through humiliation traps and ancient rituals to claim her place. Elara did not raise her voice in anger. She spoke with the quiet authority of one who had earned every inch of the ground she now stood upon. The old ways served some, she said, her gaze moving across each face. But they silenced too many. Today we choose a different path, one where every gift is valued and no one is forced to remain invisible because of the circumstances of their birth. The debate that followed was fierce and unyielding. The old guard argued tradition and stability, while Elara countered with vision and the lived truth of what she had overcome. She did not rely solely on her speed, though she demonstrated its controlled power once when a heated moment threatened to spill into something more dangerous. The gift served as a reminder of the strength she carried, but her true weapon was the wisdom she had gained through pain and transformation. She listened to their concerns, even as she refused to bend on the core principles of equality. When one of the rivals tried to undermine the new training laws by claiming it would weaken the pack, she answered with calm certainty. Strength is not diminished when more voices are allowed to contribute. It is multiplied. The king supported her at every turn, his presence reinforcing that these changes came from partnership rather than division. Together they held the line against the final wave of resistance. As the hours stretched, the tide slowly turned. Some of the old guard began to see the truth in her words, especially when she spoke of the Omegas and others who had been lost to silence and fear. Elara felt the weight of every story. She carried the memory of her father's crushed hope and her own journey from invisible to powerful. She used that weight not as a weapon, but as a bridge. By the time the council rose, the Equal Council had been formally established with representatives from every rank, including Omegas who had never before been given a seat. Laws protecting the rights of all to train and to speak were written into the pack's foundation. The old guard left with their power diminished, but with the beginning of understanding that the world had changed around them. Elara remained in the chamber long after they departed, her fingers tracing the edge of the new council table as she let the reality of what had been accomplished settle into her bones. She had defended the new order not with speed alone, but with courage, wisdom, and the unyielding belief that every soul deserved the chance to rise. The transformation that had begun in the forest and been crowned in the ancient ritual now stood complete. She was no longer the Omega who had fled the arena in tears. She was the queen who had faced the last of the resistance and emerged with the foundations of equality firmly in place. The bond with the king pulsed with quiet pride as he joined her in the now empty chamber. Together they had turned the tide of tradition and opened doors that had been closed for generations. Elara knew there would still be challenges ahead. Change of this magnitude did not settle overnight. Yet the hardest battle had been fought and won. She had used her voice and her power to protect not only herself, but everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. As she stood beside the king looking out over the Pack lands, she felt the wind stir through the open. Windows carrying the promise of a brighter future. The new order was no longer a dream. It was reality, and she had helped shape it with every step she had taken from invisibility to this moment of lasting impact. The path ahead would require continued courage, but Elara walked it now with the full strength of one who had become exactly who she was meant to be. Time had woven its gentle threads through the Pack lands, turning seasons into years and years into a legacy that no one could have imagined on the day an Omega fled the arena in tears. Elara stood on a wide balcony overlooking the thriving academy she and the Alpha King had built. Together its grounds alive with wolves of every rank training side by side. The wind that had once been her secret now moved freely across open fields where young Omegas ran, with the same impossible speed she had discovered in the forest. Laughter and focused effort filled the air, replacing the old silence that had once defined so many lives. Beside the academy stood the sanctuary, a place of safety and healing for those who had been made to feel invisible. Within its walls, Omegas and others who had carried the weight of old traditions found voice and purpose. The Equal Council met regularly in the Great Hall, its members drawn from every station, shaping decisions with wisdom that honored both strength and compassion. Elara watched it all with quiet pride, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her growing belly, where new life stirred a child who would inherit a world far brighter than the one she had been born into. The Alpha King joined her on the balcony, his presence steady and warm as it had been through every challenge and every triumph. Their partnership had deepened into a love that needed no grand declarations, only the quiet certainty of two souls who had chosen each other again and again. He placed his hand over hers, and together they looked out over the legacy they had built. Elara's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the long road from invisibility to this moment. She remembered the humiliation, the secret runs, the political traps, and the ancient ritual that had crowned her power. She remembered the fear that had once kept her silent, and the courage that had finally set her free. Every step had been necessary. Every tear and every victory had shaped the queen she had become. The wind had chosen her not to run alone, but to lead others into the light. Now Omegas trained without shame. Now voices once silent spoke in council. Now a child would grow up knowing that station was not a cage, but a starting point from which anyone could rise. She turned to the king, her eyes bright with the emotion of all they had accomplished together. "We did this," she said softly, "not because we were the strongest or the fastest, but because we refused to let the old ways define what was possible." He smiled, the same quiet respect in his gaze that had first appeared under the stars the night he offered his sincere apology. "You did this," he answered. "I only had the wisdom to stand beside you." Their hands remained joined as the wind stirred around them, carrying the sounds of the academy and the sanctuary like a song of hope. The Equal Council was already debating new protections and new opportunities. The future stretched ahead, bright and full of promise. Elara felt the child move again, and she smiled, knowing this new life would never have to fight for the right to be seen. She had changed the world not with a single act of speed, but with the steady courage to keep choosing voice over silence and inclusion over fear. The wind that had once been her hidden gift now belonged to everyone who dared to run. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.